I believed tonight's signature was a temporary step to save my company from financial suffocation. I never knew that for 8 months. The woman I welcomed into my boardroom had been quietly measuring my career's coffin. Then, standing in my hallway before my pen touched the final page, I heard her laugh. In one freezing moment, I finally understood. I wasn't saving my business. I was handing it to another woman, with my husband standing right beside her. My name is Everly Fisher. I am 38 years old, and I built my life on the mathematics of honesty. I am the founder of North Key Recovery Group, a specialized consulting firm rooted deeply in the business district of Indianapolis. We do the unglamorous, highly necessary, and often contentious work of reconstruction cost auditing, contract leakage detection, and fee recovery. When a civil board suspects they are being overcharged for municipal highway concrete, or a regional hospital system realizes they are bleeding capital through padded contractor invoices and ghost hours, my team goes in. We rip the financial floorboards up. We trace every invoice, every bloated margin, every hidden markup, and we find the missing money. I built North Key from a wobbly folding table in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city. Back then, my only overhead was black coffee, a secondhand laptop, and a stubbornly high electric bill. I knocked on doors that remained firmly shut. I was a young woman telling older, established men that their trusted vendors were robbing them blind. It was not an easy sell. But I had a gift for reading the lies buried in a spreadsheet faster than anyone else in the Midwest. I secured my first small audit, recovered a significant sum for a local clinic, and word spread. Over the years, that folding table evolved into a sleek corporate office. My solitary late nights transformed into a finely tuned machine composed of 24 dedicated employees. We built a rock-solid reputation based purely on precision and an absolute, unyielding integrity. North Key was not just my business. It was the physical manifestation of my grit. But a company is not just its founder, and for a long time, I deeply believed its heart was shared. My husband, Nolan Wren, is 42 years old. He stepped into the company 6 years ago to take over our expanding operations. Nolan was everything I was not, where I was sharp, analytical, and prone to losing my patience with bureaucratic posturing. Nolan was the consummate charmer. He possessed a natural, effortless magnetism that commanded a room without intimidating it. He knew exactly how to dress up a contentious meeting with a catered lunch, a warm smile, and perfectly timed small talk. He knew how to make nervous investors and defensive hospital administrators feel like they were the smartest people in the room. He was the soft, diplomatic counterpart to my hard, uncompromising edges. We were the perfect pair, both at home in our kitchen and in the high-stakes boardroom. We finished each other's sentences. We anticipated each other's professional needs. For a long time, I genuinely believed our marriage was the ultimate safety net, an unbreakable partnership that insulated us from the cutthroat nature of our industry. Then came the last 12 months. The economic climate shifted, municipal budgets tightened, and the dominoes began to fall. We found ourselves caught in a brutal, suffocating cash flow squeeze. Two of our largest institutional clients delayed their payments by over 2 fiscal quarters, citing internal restructuring and bureaucratic red tape. On top of that, a massive, lucrative municipal contract we had already staffed up and prepared for was abruptly paused pending a sudden city council review. The money stopped flowing in, but the expenses did not stop flowing out. Suddenly, the payroll for my 24 employees felt like a physical anvil resting heavily on my chest. I knew their families, I knew their mortgages. North Key was not collapsing. We had strong receivables, we had valuable intellectual property, and we had a backlog of signed agreements waiting to activate. But the company was tired, and I was deeply fundamentally exhausted. When you spend every waking hour staring at a shrinking operating account, fighting fires, and fielding calls from nervous vendors, it becomes dangerously easy to be convinced that the sky is falling, even when the structural foundation of your house is still largely intact. That was exactly when Nolan brought a solution into our lives. Her name was Adrienne Cole. Adrian was a restructuring expert, though she preferred the sleek, modern title of strategic transition consultant. She was sharp, impeccably polished, and possessed a quiet, clinical intensity that commanded attention without ever raising its voice. She spoke about corporate crises not as terrifying existential threats, but as simple, solvable math equations that other, less disciplined people had simply miscalculated. She did not force her way into our company. That was the dark brilliance of her methodology. She did not kick down the door and demand authority or an immediate seat at the head of the table. Instead, she slipped in softly through the cracks of my fatigue, armed with an overwhelming aura of usefulness. It started small and seemingly innocent. She reviewed a slide deck for a crucial bank presentation and made the narrative infinitely stronger. She stayed late in the conference room, eating cold takeout with Nolan and me while we audited a stubborn, messy ledger. She sent me supportive, empathetic text messages on Sunday mornings, reminding me to take a breath, drink some water, and remember that Rome was not built in a day. She came to our home for dinner, bringing a perfectly selected bottle of wine and complimenting the exact architectural details I had chosen during our living room renovation. She was pleasant, highly competent, and seemingly devoid of the aggressive ego that usually accompanied her profession. Slowly, methodically, over the course of 8 months, Adrian became the constant, reassuring hum in the background of my professional life. More importantly, she became the person Nolan instinctively referenced whenever I hesitated on a difficult decision. It was always a gentle suggestion. He would say, "Let us see what Adrian thinks about this projection," or "Adrian had a brilliant thought on this vendor issue yesterday." She even masterfully disagreed with Nolan on minor points in front of me, siding with my logic, which only deepened my false sense of security in her objectivity. I was too completely consumed by the stress of keeping my company afloat to notice that my own husband had systematically outsourced his professional trust, and perhaps much more, to another woman. The culmination of those 8 grueling months sat under the warm light of the mahogany desk in my home office tonight. It was a thick, meticulously bound legal portfolio that Adrian referred to as a temporary stabilization package. Inside its crisp pages lay the supposed salvation of my life's work. It contained complex provisions for immediate bridge capital to cover our urgent payroll needs, a comprehensive restructuring of our current vendor obligations, and the centerpiece of the entire arrangement, a 90-day voting proxy. The proxy was designed, in Adrian's soothing, professional words, to keep the company entirely safe and fully operational while I stepped back to finally take a breath and recover my health. It temporarily transferred my executive decision-making authority to a management trust controlled by her firm. Theoretically, this was meant to shield North Key from aggressive creditor actions and streamline operations while the new bridge capital was carefully deployed. I hated the document. I hated the weight of it. Every instinct I had honed since my days sitting at that cheap folding table screamed against handing over the keys to the kingdom I had built. Even for 90 short days, the fine print felt suffocating. The corporate structure felt overly complex and suspiciously rigid for the straightforward problem at hand, but I was so profoundly, debilitatingly tired. My shoulders ached constantly. I had not slept a full, uninterrupted night in nearly a year. I looked at Nolan earlier in the evening. He had stood by the office door with a gentle, encouraging smile, his hand resting reassuringly on the doorframe. He told me that this was the right move, the smart move, the only mature move that guaranteed our loyal employees would get their paychecks cleared on Friday morning. I trusted him. I loved him. For 6 years, he had been the calm harbor in my storm. I let his soothing voice and Adrian's perfectly crafted logic drown out my own internal alarms. I convinced myself that putting my name on the dotted line tonight was simply the difficult act of a responsible leader. It was the necessary, selfless sacrifice of a founder who knew she had to save the ship before she could worry about her own pride or control. I told myself it was just a signature on a piece of paper. It was just 90 days of relinquishing control. It was just a temporary bridge over deeply troubled water, and soon, everything would return to normal. I left the binder open on my desk, the heavy fountain pen resting precisely beside the final signature line. I decided I just needed a cold glass of water from the kitchen before I walked back in and made it official. I stepped out of the office, rubbing my tired eyes, and walked down the long, quiet hallway of the home I had paid for with years of sweat, sacrifice, and unyielding focus. I was thoroughly beaten down by the pressure. I was completely ready to surrender my burdens. I was ready to let my husband and his brilliant consultant save me. The heavy leather binder lay waiting on my mahogany desk. I had promised Nolan I would sign it right after dinner. A bonded courier was already scheduled to arrive at 8 in the morning to collect the finalized paperwork and deliver it straight to the bridge financiers. The ink was all that was missing. I stepped out of the office, intending to grab a glass of ice water from the kitchen to clear the lingering fog of exhaustion from my throat. My bare feet made absolutely no sound against the long expanse of the hardwood floor. The house was quiet. It was the heavy, insulated quiet of a wealthy suburban neighborhood at night. The only illumination came from the kitchen at the far end of the hall, spilling a sharp rectangle of golden light across the dark floorboards. I was halfway down the corridor when I heard the sound. It was the sharp, unmistakable clink of expensive crystal, a wine glass being set down on the marble island. Then came a voice. "Adrienne." I stopped. I did not freeze out of fear. I froze because the tone of her voice was completely alien to me. Gone was the measured, highly professional cadence she used in the boardroom. Gone was the gentle, overly empathetic pitch she used when she brought me coffee and told me to rest. The voice drifting down the hallway was loose. It was lazy. It was laced with the thick, undeniable arrogance of someone who had just won a very long, very exhausting game. It was the sound of a woman kicking off her heels in a house she already believed she owned. Nolan was in the kitchen with her. I had left them clearing the dinner plates. Assuming Adrienne was about to call her car and head back to her hotel, I stood perfectly still in the shadows. For a few agonizing seconds, my exhausted brain struggled to process the audio. I thought they were discussing a difficult client. I thought they were venting about the stress of the day. Then, Adrienne laughed. It was a soft, throaty sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "She still thinks this is a temporary operating proxy," Adrienne said. Her words were crisp, cutting through the quiet house like a scalpel. "By the time it converts, everything will be in my name." The air in my lungs turned to solid ice. I did not breathe. I could not breathe. I waited for Nolan to speak. I waited for my husband to sound confused. I waited for him to defend me, to correct her, to ask what on earth she was talking about. When Nolan finally responded, his voice was a low, resonant murmur. It was the exact intimate pitch he used with me late at night when the doors were locked and the world was shut out. It was a tone I had foolishly believed was exclusively mine. "She is entirely too exhausted to read the fine print," Nolan said. There was no hesitation in his voice. There was only a chilling, casual cruelty. "She is so obsessed with saving the sinking ship. She has not even looked up to see who has been drilling holes in the hull for the last 8 months. The hallway seemed to tilt. I pressed my palm flat against the cold plaster of the wall to keep my balance. "We paced it perfectly," Adrienne replied, the smug satisfaction practically dripping from her words. The inflated strategic consulting fees, the sudden, inexplicable vendor delays, the intense liquidity pressure, it was all a carefully calibrated rhythm. The more tired she got, the more obedient she became. You just had to play the supportive husband holding her hand while she bled out. Obedient. The word struck me harder than a physical blow to the jaw. They had not merely taken advantage of a struggling company. They had manufactured the entire crisis, the sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, the panic attacks in the employee restroom, the crushing guilt I felt when I looked at my staff, wondering if I could make the next payroll. It was all a stage play. They had written the script, built the set, and watched me perform my agonizing role day after day. I stood in the dark, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. But there was more. The conversation shifted, and the final illusion shattered. I heard the subtle rustle of clothing, a soft, breathless sigh from Adrian. Nolan murmured something indistinct, his voice muffled, perhaps against her neck. The silence that followed was heavy, charged, and unmistakably physical. This was not just corporate espionage. They were not merely business accomplices executing a hostile takeover. They had crossed the professional boundary a very long time ago. My husband and my supposed savior were standing in the kitchen I had designed, drinking the wine I had purchased, entangled with one another while dividing up my life like spoils of war. "Once the conversion hits," Adrian said, her voice dropping lower, tighter, all business again despite the intimacy, "I will sweep the accounts receivable. I will absorb the proprietary data models. Every single lucrative client renewal will simply redirect. I will pull it all straight into Coalbridge Strategic Partners. North Key will be an empty shell by the end of the fiscal quarter." Coalbridge Strategic Partners. Her boutique firm. The master plan was brutally elegant. Use my husband to gain access. Create a fake financial emergency. Offer a lifeline disguised as a temporary proxy. Use my own exhaustion to get my signature. Then, legally strip the company of its assets, its clients, and its core data models, funneling everything into her own entity. If I signed that paper tonight, North Key would not be saved. It would be legally butchered, and I would be handing them the knife. A normal woman would have walked into that kitchen right then. A normal wife would have screamed until her throat bled. She would have grabbed the heavy crystal wine bottle and smashed it against the marble countertop. She would have demanded answers. She would have thrown them both out onto the street. She would have let the hot, blinding rage dictate her actions. I did none of those things. I did not step into the light. I did not make a single sound. I did not shed a tear. Standing there in the pitch-black hallway, I felt my heart rate begin to slow down. The overwhelming, debilitating exhaustion that had plagued me for nearly a year simply vanished, evaporating into the cold air. It was replaced by something else. It was replaced by a terrifying, crystalline clarity. Anger is a hot emotion. Anger is messy. Anger makes reckless mistakes. Anger yells in kitchens and throws things. What I felt in that moment was absolute zero. It was a profound, chilling detachment. I was no longer a tired founder trying to save her company. I was no longer a betrayed wife discovering her husband's infidelity. I was a forensic auditor staring at a massive, glaring discrepancy, and I knew exactly how to track discrepancies. I knew how to hunt liars. It was what I did better than anyone else in the city. I slowly took one step backward, carefully placing my bare foot on the floorboard so it would not creak. Then I took another step. I retreated silently into the darkness of the hallway, moving away from the light of the kitchen. They wanted the company. They wanted the assets. They wanted me out of the way. They thought I was a beaten, obedient dog ready to roll over and hand them the leash. Fine, let them think that. From this exact second forward, I would no longer be the victim of their meticulously crafted narrative. I was going to let them keep talking. I was going to let them drink my wine and feel victorious. I was going to maintain the illusion of the exhausted, grateful founder, but I was not going to be their prey. I was going to let them write, sign, and seal the very documents that would orchestrate their own utter destruction. I turned my back to the kitchen light. I walked silently back to my home office. I closed the heavy oak door and locked it with a soft, decisive click. I did not need a glass of water anymore. I had a portfolio to dissect. The click of the brass lock engaging on my office door was the loudest sound I had heard all night. It was the sound of a vault ceiling. I walked past the heavy leather binder sitting on my desk, the one holding the temporary stabilization proxy. I did not throw it in the trash. I carefully pushed it to the far corner of the mahogany wood, treating it exactly like what it was. Exhibit A. My grief did not manifest as tears. It manifested as a hyper-focused, predatory calm. I walked over to the tall, fireproof filing cabinets bolted to the back wall. I bypassed the recent operational files and unlocked the bottom drawer, pulling out the foundational archives of the business. I spread the heavy, yellowing legal documents across the floor. sitting cross-legged among them like a detective surveying a fresh, bloody crime scene. I needed the original operating agreements from the era of our first major growth capital injection. I flipped through hundreds of pages of dense legalese until my fingers stopped on a specific, forgotten rider. The Founder Continuity Addendum. It was a protective measure my initial investors had insisted upon years ago to shield the firm from chaotic internal politics. I read paragraph 4, whispering the words to the empty room. Any transfer of executive voting rights or operational control is immediately rendered null and void if an undisclosed personal or financial relationship exists between the assigned beneficiary and any acting corporate officer. I smiled. It was a thin, cold expression. Adrian and Nolan thought their illicit affair was their ultimate secret weapon. They thought their intimacy was the glue holding their brilliant conspiracy together. In reality, their physical relationship was the exact legal landmine that would completely invalidate her hostile takeover. By sleeping with my husband while negotiating for my proxy, Adrian had legally poisoned her own well. But I needed more than just a voided contract. I needed her to bleed. I turned my attention to the core infrastructure of the business. Adrian's entire strategy hinged on absorbing our lucrative client renewals and our proprietary data models into her boutique firm. She was an expert at restructuring debt, but she fundamentally misunderstood the architecture of my success. She assumed the company was a single, vulnerable monolith. She did not realize the actual brain of the operation, the Stormtrace matrix, did not belong to the corporate entity she was trying to steal. Stormtrace was the custom algorithm I had painstakingly coded in my 20s, the software that actually detected the municipal contract anomalies. It was housed inside a completely separate, airtight holding company where I was the sole, uncontested managing member. Adrian could legally siphon away the outer shell of the consulting firm, but without the matrix. She was hijacking a commercial jet without an engine. She would not be able to process a single audit. She was walking into an empty, useless trap. Then, my thoughts shifted to the man sleeping upstairs. I opened my personal floor safe and extracted a thick ivory envelope. Inside was the post-nuptial agreement we had executed 5 years ago when I decided to grant Nolan a 4% equity stake in the firm to make him feel like a true partner. I flipped to subsection 12. The language was brutal and absolute. Any deliberate concealment of corporate cash flow or any unauthorized diversion of company assets to a third party constituted a material breach of fiduciary duty. A breach triggered an automatic, unappealable forfeiture of his entire equity stake and barred him from any future claim against my foundational wealth. Nolan had not merely broken his marriage vows. He had contractually engineered his own total financial ruin. I needed verification. I needed an outside pair of eyes, someone who possessed the technical skill to track the money and the loyalty to keep their mouth shut. I picked up my phone and stared at the time. It was 1:15 in the morning. I scrolled through my contacts and dialed a number I had not called in exactly 1 year. Tess Monroe answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick with sleep. Tess was my former financial controller. She was brilliant, abrasive, and completely uncompromising. She had quit 12 months ago because she adamantly refused to implement Adrian's early restructuring guidelines. Tess was the only person who had ever looked me dead in the eye and warned me that Adrian's projections were entirely too clean, perfectly arranged in a way that only fabricated numbers could be. I had dismissed her warnings, blinded by my husband's reassurances. I did not sign the proxy, I said, skipping any polite introduction. I need you in the mainframe right now. Tess did not ask a single question. I heard the rustle of bedsheets and the immediate clatter of a laptop keyboard. Within 10 minutes, she had bypassed the firm's primary security firewall using a backdoor administrator login I had deliberately never deactivated. For the next 2 hours, Tess and I sat in total silence over the phone, connected by the glow of our respective screens. We scrubbed through 7 solid months of financial subledgers. With my blinders finally removed, the pattern was glaringly obvious. It was a systematic financial massacre disguised as routine accounting. We found the orchestrated bleeds. They were hidden under intentionally boring bureaucratic labels. We found vendor acceleration fees. We found emergency operational adjustments. We found bloated restructuring retainers. Every single line item appeared legitimate at a quick glance, but when Tess isolated the routing numbers, the illusion collapsed. "Look at the disbursement dates," Tess murmured through the speakerphone, the rapid clicking of her mouse echoing in the quiet room. Every time a legitimate client payment cleared our main account, a corresponding emergency fee was triggered within 24 hours. She traced the digital trail. The funds funneled into a complex web of regional shell accounts, bouncing twice to obscure their origin, but the final destination for every single stolen dollar was always the same: Coalbridge Strategic Partners, or one of its newly registered satellite entities. I did not simply stop at discovering the betrayal. I meticulously quantified it. I opened a fresh, encrypted spreadsheet and began building a brutal, indisputable timeline. I worked with the cold, mechanical precision of an executioner sharpening a blade. I logged the exact date of every fraudulent transfer. I logged the specific hour. I documented the falsified expense category. I recorded the authorizing digital signature, which belonged exclusively to Nolan in every single instance. And I recorded the ultimate beneficiary, which was always Adrian. By 4:30 in the morning, my eyes were burning, but I possessed a bulletproof digital package. It was a complete forensic map of their conspiracy. I compressed the entire file, encrypted it with a randomized passcode, and attached it to an email directed to Lena Voss. Lena was my outside corporate litigator, a woman renowned for her vicious, scorched-earth tactics in the courtroom. I marked the subject line for immediate, critical review and hit send. I closed my laptop. The blue light faded, plunging the office back into deep shadows. The house remained dead quiet. I knew Nolan was upstairs in our sprawling master bedroom, surrounded by expensive linens, probably sleeping soundly as he dreamed of his wealthy, unburdened future. I stood up, my joints stiff from sitting on the floor, and looked at the tufted leather sofa resting in the corner of my office. I walked over, kicked off my shoes, and lay down on the cool leather, pulling a thin woven throw blanket over my shoulders. I was not sleeping down here because I was emotionally shattered. I was not hiding from my husband out of weakness or fear. I was sleeping on this narrow couch because I fully understood the new reality of my existence. The trusting woman who used to share that upstairs bed was gone forever, and from this moment forward, this entire beautiful house was nothing more than an active documentary crime scene. The morning sun breached the blinds of my home office, casting harsh, unforgiving lines across the floorboards. At exactly 7 in the morning, my secure line rang. It was Lena Voss. My attorney did not believe in pleasantries, and today, her voice was a weapon drawn from its sheath. She had spent the last 3 hours tearing apart the stabilization proxy Adrian had left on my desk. "It is a guillotine," Lena stated, the sharp rustle of thick legal paper echoing through the speakerphone. "Nolan told you it was a 90-day operational shield. That is a blatant lie. Hidden in the 9th schedule is a layered conversion structure. If the company breaches a single, mathematically impossible financial covenant during that 90-day window, the temporary proxy automatically triggers a default. That default instantly converts their temporary management rights into permanent, irrevocable executive control." I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk. They had engineered a scenario where I would willingly step out of the driver's seat, only to have them permanently lock the doors behind me. Before I could process the sheer audacity of the legal trap, Tess chimed in on the encrypted conference bridge. She had been digging through the subterranean layers of our corporate accounts since our late-night call. Her tone was devoid of its usual sarcastic bite. She was operating with the cold efficiency of a coroner. "I have isolated the exact hemorrhage," Tess reported. "Over the past several quarters, they have systematically siphoned exactly $63,400 out of our primary operating reserves. It was not taken in one massive, noticeable sweep. It was death by 1,000 microscopic paper cuts. They routed the funds through dozens of harmless-sounding classifications. software licensing updates, redundant data storage fees, expedited vendor processing. Every single one of these phantom expenses was meticulously designed to achieve two distinct goals simultaneously. I knew the answer, but hearing it spoken aloud crystallized the malice. "It starved North Key of its vital liquidity," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Exactly," Tess confirmed. "It artificially manufactured the very cash flow crisis they used to justify bringing Adrian in. But worse, that $63,400 did not just vanish. It was aggressively redirected to underwrite the legal and administrative framework required for this exact hostile takeover. You literally paid for your own execution." The sheer mechanics of their greed were breathtaking, but Lena was not finished. Her firm had utilized its extensive network within the private equity sector to quietly extract a confidential memo from the bridge capital firm Adrian had secured for our supposed rescue. "They were not just planning to steal the company," Lena said, her tone dropping an octave. "They have already mapped out the entire corporate hierarchy for the aftermath. The bridge financiers received a preliminary transition roster. On that roster, Adrian is officially designated as the successor management. Your husband is not listed as a victim of the restructuring. He is explicitly categorized as a compensated transition principal." I closed my eyes. A compensated transition principal. It was an incredibly sterile, corporate phrase for a man who had sold his wife out for a golden parachute. They had already negotiated the exact price of his treason. He was not just clearing a path for her, he was being paid a premium to push me off the ledge. The revelation prompted a dark, sudden suspicion regarding my own internal communications. While keeping Lena and Tess on the line, I logged into the master administrative portal of North Key's secure servers. I bypassed my standard inbox and dove directly into the back-end security protocols, pulling the access logs from my personal executive email account. The betrayal was deeply embedded in the digital architecture of my daily life. Months ago, Nolan had casually requested parallel administrative access to my server hub. His reasoning had been wrapped in a cloak of profound, husbandly concern. He claimed he wanted to monitor the inbound traffic just in case I became too overwhelmed, so he could filter out the noise and let me focus on the macro strategy. I had granted the permission without a second thought. Now, staring at the raw server data, I saw the truth. He had not been filtering noise. He had been quietly reading every single confidential thread between me and the board of directors. Even more violating, I discovered a hidden, automated forwarding rule buried deep in the server's settings. Any incoming message containing specific, highly sensitive keywords was instantly and silently copied to a private, external inbox controlled by Nolan. The keywords were incredibly precise: client renewal, debt restructuring, strategic operations, emergency liquidity. He had planted a digital wiretap in the very center of my professional sanctuary. Every moment of panic I had confessed in late-night emails to my advisors. Every strategic maneuver I had contemplated to save the firm had been instantly delivered to the very people orchestrating my downfall. He had proactively invaded my decision-making space, feeding my vulnerabilities directly to his mistress. "I want to fire him," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I want to lock them both out of the building. I want to file the injunction today." "We could," Lena replied steadily. "The evidence we have right now is absolutely sufficient to halt the signing of the proxy. I can draft a cease and desist by noon. But listen to me very carefully. Everly, if you strike right now, you leave them a tiny, miserable window to spin a defense. They will claim this was all a massive, complicated business misunderstanding. They will argue the funds were misallocated by error, that the bridge memo was a draft, that the email forwarding was standard operational oversight. They will hire aggressive counsel, and they will drag you through years of agonizing, muddy litigation." Lena paused, letting the heavy reality of the legal system settle over the line. "If you want to completely obliterate their ability to mount a defense, if you want to destroy them so thoroughly that no judge in this state will ever look at them without disgust, you need an undeniable, unbroken chain of premeditated intent. You need them to take one more step. It was a terrifying proposition. To win the war, I had to let the enemy believe they had successfully breached the castle. I had to continue playing the exact role they had written for me. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. "Do absolutely nothing differently," Lena instructed. "Do not confront him. Do not show your hand. Let them firmly believe you are still standing on the edge of the cliff, so completely desperate and exhausted that you are totally blind to their movements." I agreed, ending the call with a heavy heart but an iron resolve. The true horrifying cost of that decision arrived a few hours later, entirely disguised as domestic tranquility. The sun had set, and I was sitting at the dining room table. The air in the house felt thick, suffocating, as though the oxygen had been carefully siphoned away. Nolan walked out of the kitchen, carrying 2 plates of perfectly roasted salmon and asparagus. He moved with the easy, relaxed grace of a man who did not have a single care in the world. He set the plate gently down in front of me, taking his seat across the polished wood. I looked at the man I had married. I looked at the hands that had supposedly built a life with me. He picked up his fork, his eyes meeting mine. His expression was a flawless masterpiece of gentle, unconditional support. "Are you okay?" Nolan asked, his voice a soft, comforting murmur. "You look so incredibly tired tonight. We can wait on the paperwork if you need to rest." A cold chill cascaded down my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. It was the most terrifying moment of my entire life. I had spent my career dealing with aggressive contractors, screaming municipal managers, and outright corporate thieves. I was accustomed to conflict that announced itself loudly, but sitting across from my husband, staring into his warm, empathetic eyes, I finally understood the deepest, most dangerous truth about deception. The absolute worst kind of betrayal does not arrive accompanied by a loud, dramatic argument. It does not announce itself with a thrown glass or a slammed door. It does not scream. The most devastating, lethal betrayal arrives quietly, serving you dinner on a warm plate, looking you directly in the eyes, and asking if you are okay in a voice so sweet it makes you want to cry. I forced my facial muscles to soften. I let my shoulders slump, perfectly mimicking the posture of a defeated, utterly broken woman. "I am just so tired," I whispered, delivering the exact lie he needed to hear. "But I will be fine," he smiled, a gentle, reassuring curve of his lips, and began to eat. He thought he was comforting a victim. He had absolutely no idea he was dining with his executioner. The architecture of a perfect trap requires an intimate understanding of your prey's specific brand of greed. Adrian and my husband did not just want to take my company. They wanted to feel brilliantly superior while doing it. They believed they were the smartest people in the room, playing a high-stakes game against a woman too tired to notice the board had been flipped. To catch them, Lena and I had to give them exactly what they were looking for: a golden, irresistible shortcut. I spent the entire morning in a secure conference room at Lena's downtown firm, constructing a masterpiece of corporate fiction. We called it the Master Asset and Capability Summary. Ostensibly, it was a highly confidential internal dossier prepared for my final, private review before the upcoming bridge funding meetings. The true beauty of this fabricated document lay in its absolute, unquestionable authenticity. We printed it on the genuine heavy stock paper bearing the North Key letterhead. We meticulously inputted the real client identification codes, the accurate historical revenue columns spanning the last 4 quarters, and the correct, complex legal entity formatting that only an insider would know how to draft. To the untrained eye, or even to a highly trained consultant desperate for a killing stroke, it looked like the holy grail of my private financial records. But beneath that authentic surface, we wove a tapestry of lethal, undeniable falsehoods. We altered the core operational metrics just enough to make the company look riper for the picking. We inserted a completely fabricated asset, a shadow reserve fund we named the Hollow Lantern Escrow. We padded this ghost account with a fictional cash balance of $640,000. It was designed to look like a quiet, rainy day fund I had hidden away from the primary ledgers. It was a juicy, untraceable pile of cash that any corporate raider would immediately try to absorb into their own restructuring fees. We also deliberately rolled back the firm's overall proprietary valuation to a depressed figure from 3 years ago, making their hostile takeover appear to be an even more spectacular, lucrative bargain. Most importantly, we entirely scrubbed any mention of the founder continuity addendum from the capital structure appendix. We reformatted the paragraphs to make it look as though my foundational, bulletproof protections had simply vanished in a clumsy clerical oversight. To ensure airtight traceability, I added one final, microscopic detail. Deep within the operational appendix, on page 47, I intentionally inverted a specific internal accounting symbol next to a minor tax liability line. I also misspelled the word fiduciary by swapping the vowels in a single, densely worded paragraph regarding transition logistics. It was a digital fingerprint. It was a completely unique, flawed strand of DNA. If those specific errors, or the fictitious hollow lantern escrow, ever materialized in any legal filing outside of my home, I would possess absolute, irrefutable proof of the exact document they stole and exactly who stole it. I carried the bait back to my house that afternoon and set the stage. The physical placement of the dossier had to be flawless. If I hid it too well inside a locked drawer, Nolan would never find it. If I left it perfectly centered on the pristine surface of my desk, illuminated by the reading lamp, it would scream of deliberate entrapment. I chose the psychological middle ground. I placed the thick blue binder slightly askew near the far edge of my mahogany desk. I partially covered the glossy cover with a messy stack of mundane utility bills and a printed copy of our corporate health insurance policy. It looked exactly like the careless, disorganized clutter of an exhausted executive who had simply run out of energy before finishing her evening filing. It was visible enough for a snooping husband to spot, but concealed enough to make him feel like a genius for discovering it. That evening required the greatest, most agonizing acting performance of my entire life. Nolan returned from his evening run smelling of fresh air and expensive eucalyptus, his demeanor radiating an unnatural, buoyant warmth. He poured me a glass of sparkling water and sat across from me in the living room. His voice was thick with manufactured tenderness as he asked if I was finally feeling a sense of relief about letting the bridge package move forward. He wanted to know if the heavy burden was lifting off my shoulders. I looked at the man whose ring I still wore. I forced my facial muscles to remain slack. I made my eyes look dead, glassy, and defeated. I gave him a weak, barely perceptible nod. I told him I was just glad the hardest decisions were finally out of my hands. I watched his shoulders visibly relax. I watched the subtle, victorious gleam light up the back of his eyes. He read exactly what he desperately wanted to read into my silence. He saw total capitulation. He saw a woman too broken to fight back. Later that night, as I lay rigidly in the guest bedroom staring at the ceiling, my phone buzzed violently against the wooden nightstand. It was a long, incredibly detailed text message from Adrienne. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her words made the blood run cold in my veins. She spoke to me in a saccharine, overly intimate tone, assuring me that stepping back was not a sign of failure, but a profound testament to my maturity as a leader. She promised to shoulder the heavy administrative burdens so I could focus entirely on healing my spirit and saving my marriage. She actually used the phrase woman to woman in the third sentence. Reading that message, any lingering, microscopic trace of hesitation I might have harbored completely evaporated. She was wrapping her venom in a warm, suffocating blanket of fake feminist solidarity. She was patronizing me while actively picking my pockets. I decided right then that she did not deserve a quick, painless exit from my industry. I was going to strip her professional reputation down to the bone, and I was going to make her watch as I did it. The trap lay in the dark office all night and into the next morning. The following afternoon, I was sitting back in the secure conference room at Lena's office, reviewing the legitimate operational files. At exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, my private encrypted laptop chimed with a piercing, high-priority security alert. My internal technology team, Operating under strict, lawful monitoring protocols we had established the previous day, had flagged a severe network anomaly. The bait document had just been accessed. The system log showed it was not simply being opened and read, it was being actively scanned, page by agonizing page, using a mobile phone document capture application. The Internet Protocol address pinged directly to the secure router located inside my own house. Nolan was standing in my office at that exact second, photographing the trap. I sat perfectly still, listening to the hum of the city traffic outside the window, watching the progress bar on the security log inch forward. 10 minutes later, a second, definitive alert triggered. The scanned image files had been compressed and transmitted outbound from my home network. The destination address was not a secure corporate server. It was routed directly to a private, encrypted email account that our forensic investigators had already definitively linked to Adrienne Cole. She had the fake numbers. She had the misspelled words. She had the hollow lantern escrow. I did not celebrate. I did not smile. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindication. I simply took a screenshot of the outbound transmission log, capturing the exact hour and minute the theft occurred. I attached the image to a fresh email and sent it to Lena, who was sitting directly across the polished wooden table from me. I typed a single, brief message in the body of the email. She took the bait. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my heavy leather chair. Feeling the cool air of the room wash over my face, the narrative had officially shifted. We were no longer frantically patching holes in a sinking ship to prevent a disaster. We had handed the arsonists a massive can of gasoline composed entirely of water. From this moment forward, my only job was to stand back and wait for them to strike the match and proudly sign their own names to the ashes. The Rivergate Renewal Gala was the crown jewel of the city's corporate social calendar. It was a sprawling, opulent event held in the grand ballroom of the historic downtown hotel, packed tightly with municipal decision-makers, heavy-hitting infrastructure sponsors, and the advisory boards of our largest regional hospital clients. The air was thick with the scent of expensive floral centerpieces and the quiet, continuous murmur of high-stakes networking. I stood near the edge of the champagne fountain, a glass of sparkling water resting in my hand, and watched the room operate. Specifically, I watched her. Adrienne did not navigate the crowded floor like an external restructuring consultant hired to patch a leak. She glided through the throngs of wealthy donors and powerful executives with the unhurried, magnetic entitlement of someone who had already ascended to the ownership class. She wore a sleek, dark emerald gown that caught the light, and her laughter rang out, a crystalline, practice sound that drew immediate attention. Nolan was never more than a few feet away from her. They were highly calculated in their public choreography. They maintained just enough physical distance to prevent any casual observer from making an immediate accusation. There was no touching, no overt whispering. Yet, to a wife who had spent over half a decade studying the precise geography of her husband's body language, the illicit intimacy was deafening. It was in the way his shoulders angled slightly toward her whenever she spoke. It was the microsecond of shared eye contact across a group of investors when a joke was made. It was an invisible, electric tether binding them together in plain sight. I was abruptly pulled from my observation by the heavy, jovial presence of Boone Kessler. Boone was the lead broker for the Bridge Capital Group, a man whose tailored suits always looked a fraction too tight and whose smile never quite reached his eyes. He sidled up next to me, swirling amber liquid in a heavy crystal tumbler. "Magnificent turnout tonight," Boone noted, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial register. "I have to say, you are handling this transition phase with remarkable grace. Most founders in your position would be clawing at the walls, but you are showing real maturity." The phrase transition phase hit my ears like a physical strike. I had not signed a single binding document yet. The official narrative was still a temporary stabilization proxy. For Boone to casually refer to it as a transition phase meant he had been privy to deeply unauthorized, forward-looking discussions. He was already talking about my departure as a concrete historical fact. I did not throw my drink in his face. I did not correct his vocabulary. Instead, I softened my posture. I let my shoulders drop a fraction of an inch and manufactured a weary, deeply grateful smile. I played the exact role of the exhausted, yielding founder he expected to see. "It has been a grueling year, Boone," I murmured, keeping my tone perfectly docile. "I am just looking forward to the quiet. I want to know everything is finally settled." My engineered vulnerability worked flawlessly. Boone puffed his chest out slightly, eager to play the reassuring savior. "You have absolutely nothing to worry about," he promised, leaning in closer. "The finalized schedules are being submitted bright and early on Monday morning. Once that final ink dries on your signature, the stabilization accounts will be activated within 48 hours. You can finally step back and take that long vacation." Monday morning, the timeline was set. He was going to push the paperwork through using the exact poisoned data I had left on my desk. A few moments later, Boone drifted away to corner a local politician, and Tess appeared at my elbow. I had brought her as my private guest. Knowing I needed eyes and ears in the corners of the room, I could not stomach visiting myself. Tess looked striking in a sharp black suit, holding a flute of champagne she had not sipped. "I just spent 5 minutes standing directly behind your husband's new favorite strategist," Tess said quietly, her eyes tracking Adrian across the room. "She is holding court with the chief financial officer of the regional medical board." "And what exactly is she telling him?" I asked, my voice flat. Tess turned her head slightly, keeping her voice pitched strictly for my ears. "She just told him that some people are incredibly great at building a thing from scratch, but they simply do not have the stomach to keep it growing when the weather turns rough." The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of the statement sent a spike of pure, unadulterated adrenaline straight into my bloodstream. My grip on my glass tightened until my knuckles turned stark white. Every defensive instinct I possessed screamed at me to march directly across the ballroom. I wanted to step into the center of that wealthy circle, slap that smug, unearned confidence right off her perfectly contoured face, and loudly declare exactly what she was. I wanted to watch the shock register in her eyes when I told the hospital board she was funding her hostile takeover with stolen operational capital. I took a sharp breath, and I stopped myself. A premature explosion here, in the middle of a party, would be a catastrophic tactical error. If I blew the lid off the conspiracy tonight, they would immediately retreat. They would play the victims. They would claim I was having an emotionally unstable breakdown due to the corporate stress. I needed them to feel completely safe. I needed them to take that final, fatal step and legally submit the forged, booby-trapped documents on Monday. A public screaming match would only give my enemies the very opportunity to deny everything. I handed my untouched sparkling water to a passing waiter and walked silently out of the main ballroom. I navigated the heavy brass doors and stepped into the expansive marble-lined women's restroom. It was blissfully empty. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the climate control system. I walked up to the long row of mirrors illuminated by harsh, unforgiving vanity lights. I braced my hands against the cool marble of the counter and stared directly into my own eyes. I studied the faint lines of exhaustion around my temples. I studied the subtle tension in my jaw. In that quiet, brightly lit space, I realized a profound truth. The impending death of my marriage was only a fraction of the tragedy. What was truly dying tonight was an entire version of myself. I was mourning the woman who had spent the last decade constantly accommodating everyone else. The woman who prioritized a peaceful household over her own gut instincts. The woman who made herself smaller, softer, and more malleable, just so the men around her could feel comfortable and in control. That woman was officially dead. I buried her right there under the fluorescent lights. I pulled a tube of dark red lipstick from my clutch, applied it with steady, methodical precision, and smoothed the lapels of my tailored jacket. I turned away from the mirror without looking back. When I pushed the heavy doors open and re-entered the chaotic, glittering ballroom, I wore a flawless, impenetrable smile. I walked right past Nolan, offering him a polite, wifely nod that he returned with a look of utter relief. I mingled. I shook hands. I played the part of the fading star stepping gracefully into the shadows. And as I watched them silently celebrate their impending victory, I knew that my absolute, serene calmness was the most dangerous weapon in the room. They had entirely mistaken my silence for surrender, completely unaware that it was actually the quiet pull of a trigger. The week began not with a surrender, but with a silent, ironclad lockdown. At exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning, hours before my scheduled meeting with the courier, my attorney executed the first offensive maneuver. Lena Voss did not file a public lawsuit or a noisy injunction. Instead, she quietly submitted a formal intellectual property dispute notice to the state registry. Simultaneously, she issued confidential, legally binding preservation mandates to every single financial institution, board member, and vendor associated with North Key Recovery Group. The language in the mandates was meticulously aggressive. It placed an immediate, hard freeze on our proprietary data models, our internal algorithms, and our core operational frameworks. If Adrienne or her accomplices attempted to quietly transfer my life's work in the shadows while waiting for my signature to clear, they would instantly trigger a massive federal response. The vault was completely sealed from the outside, and the thieves were entirely unaware they were already locked inside. Then, we waited for the arrogance of our enemies to do the rest of the heavy lifting. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the confirmation arrived. As Boone Kessler had casually promised at the gala, Adrienne's legal team formally submitted their preliminary control framework to the bridge financiers. A paralegal at Lena's office intercepted the digitized packet through standard opposing counsel discovery channels. I sat in Lena's sleek downtown conference room, staring at the projected screen on the wall. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm as Lena opened the 9th schedule of their submission. There it was, printed in crisp, black ink on their supposedly independent, highly researched financial assessment, was the Hollow Lantern escrow. They had listed the fictitious reserve account, complete with the fabricated $640,000 cash balance, as a primary collateral asset to secure their transitional management fees. It was a breathtaking moment of profound, catastrophic stupidity, but they did not stop there. Lena zoomed in on the bottom of page 47. The inverted internal accounting symbol sat right next to the tax liability line, shining like a beacon. And buried deep in the transition logistics paragraph, the word fiduciary was misspelled, the vowels swapped exactly as I had typed them in the bait document on my dining room table. This was no longer a complex debate over conflicting business strategies or a misunderstanding of corporate structure. The sudden, glaring appearance of those precise, fictitious details completely obliterated their entire defense. Their highly polished operational transition portfolio was instantly transformed into undeniable, documented proof of corporate espionage. It was a flawless legal fingerprint left directly on the murder weapon, practically begging for a conviction. While Lena documented the stolen data, my internal team tightened the noose around my husband's neck. Rhea Dunn, my fiercely loyal office manager, had been quietly monitoring the back-end server traffic alongside our cybersecurity consultant. Rhea was a woman who noticed absolutely everything and forgave very little. She sent a secure, encrypted file directly to my inbox. It was a raw system log, proving that Nolan had bypassed his own restricted access portal. At exactly 13 minutes past 2 in the morning, just a few days prior, he had used my personal executive credentials to log into the master administrative dashboard. The Internet protocol address matched our home network perfectly. He had crept out of our bed in the dead of night, stolen my digital identity, and downloaded the fabricated financial summaries while I slept right down the hall. Moments later, Tess patched into our secure conference call. She had followed the money trail all the way to its logical, damning conclusion. She did not just find the missing operational funds, she found the structural skeleton of the takeover. They already built the slaughterhouse, Tess announced, her voice vibrating with a cold, righteous anger. I traced the final destination of those diverted vendor fees from Coalbridge Strategic Partners. The money did not sit in Adrienne's corporate account. It was immediately pushed into a newly incorporated shell entity called North Key Transition Holdings. They have an entire banking architecture sitting completely dormant, fully funded by our stolen cash, just waiting to swallow your client receivables the exact second your pen touches that proxy. The sheer scale of the premeditation was staggering. They had not merely planned to push me out of my own company. They had meticulously constructed the exact machinery required to digest my life's work whole. Lena leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the predatory thrill of a litigator who has just been handed a loaded weapon. "We are no longer fighting a simple governance dispute," Lena declared, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "I am immediately escalating this to a multi-count civil fraud litigation. We are filing for breach of fiduciary duty, gross misappropriation of proprietary information, corporate espionage, and intentional concealment of marital assets." Then, Lena delivered the final, devastating blow. She pulled up the original Founder Continuity Addendum, the vital document Adrienne thought she had successfully bypassed. They clearly believed that scrubbing the addendum from the stolen capital summary neutralized it, Lena explained, a vicious, satisfied smile playing on her lips. But they completely failed to understand the foundational mechanism of that specific clause. Because Adrienne Cole and Nolan Wren actively concealed a romantic, personal relationship while simultaneously attempting to secure a direct financial benefit from the company, the entire proxy conversion structure they built is instantly rendered null and void. But it gets even better. The addendum explicitly dictates an automatic punitive trigger. By attempting this fraudulent transfer under the cover of a hidden conflict of interest, they have automatically stripped themselves of all standing. Nolan's equity is wiped out, and Adrienne's firm is contractually barred from claiming a single cent of consulting fees. Their own hidden affair is the exact mechanism that destroys their entire claim to power. The legal web was complete. It was spun entirely from their own greed, their own lust, and their own profound underestimation of my intelligence. I left Lena's office as the sun began to set over the city skyline. I drove back to the sprawling suburban house that had become my personal war room. I walked past the kitchen, past the dining room table where the bait had been taken, and went straight into my home office. I locked the heavy oak door behind me. I lay down on the tufted leather sofa, pulling the thin woven blanket over my shoulders. For the first time in nearly a year, my mind was entirely quiet. The crushing, suffocating weight of the phantom financial crisis had evaporated. The agonizing uncertainty of my failing marriage was gone. I closed my eyes, and within minutes, I fell into a deep, uninterrupted sleep. I did not sleep soundly because my heart hurt any less. The betrayal still burned like battery acid in my chest. I slept deeply because the suffocating fog of gaslighting had finally lifted. My pain was no longer a confusing, abstract emotion that made me question my own sanity. It was now fully quantified. It had concrete metadata, undeniable timestamps, and a precise dollar amount. Most importantly, it had a designated target, and I was finally holding all the ammunition. The true counterattack of a betrayed founder does not begin with a dramatic, tearful confrontation or shattered glass on a kitchen floor. It begins by quietly, methodically changing the locks on every single door, while the thieves are still inside admiring the furniture. On Tuesday morning, I dressed in a tailored charcoal suit and drove to the administrative headquarters of our largest regional hospital client. I did not carry a box of tissues, and I did not bring a tragic story about a failing marriage. I sat across the polished conference table from their chief financial officer, a man I had worked alongside for the better part of a decade. I looked him directly in the eye and delivered a highly calibrated warning. I informed him that North Key was currently navigating an aggressive, unsolicited internal restructuring attempt spearheaded by an outside consultant. I explicitly stated that any communication he received regarding contract reassignment, vendor transition, or alternate payment routing was strictly unauthorized unless it came directly from my personal encrypted communication lines. I repeated this exact process 3 hours later at the Municipal Highway Planning Board. I did not ask for their pity. I relied entirely on the bulletproof professional equity I had spent years building. Because they knew my history of absolute, uncompromising integrity, They did not question my directives. By the end of the business day, I had successfully executed emergency continuity addendums for our two most vital and lucrative contracts. These specific legal riders bypassed the corporate entity of North Key entirely, legally tethering the massive, ongoing service agreements directly to my individual professional credential. If Adrian ultimately managed to hijack the corporate shell, she would find herself holding a completely empty vessel. I had surgically severed the main arteries of her anticipated revenue stream, and she had absolutely no idea she was already bleeding out. By Wednesday morning, the atmosphere inside my own home began to shift. Nolan must have felt the invisible walls tightening, or perhaps he simply realized my quiet compliance was lasting a little too long. The man I had married suddenly decided to change his strategy. He abandoned the distant, overly professional persona he had adopted over the last few weeks and abruptly attempted to resurrect the ghosts of our early romance. I walked into the kitchen at 7 a.m. to find him standing by the stove, flipping my favorite spinach and feta omelet. The smell of freshly ground dark roast coffee filled the room. He wore a soft, nostalgic smile, pulling out my chair for me as if the last 8 months of psychological warfare had never occurred. As I sat down, he casually brought up a vacation we took to the coast 5 years ago, weaving a narrative of how strong we used to be. Then came the pivot. He poured my coffee and gently placed his hand over mine. In a soft, deeply empathetic voice, he suggested that the recent corporate chaos was simply the unfortunate byproduct of immense pressure. He claimed that the external advisors had pushed the survival narrative too far and that everything had gotten entirely out of hand. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to lay the groundwork for plausible deniability. He was preemptively distancing himself from the very conspiracy he had helped orchestrate, testing the waters to see if his charm could still blind me. I ate the breakfast he made. I did not pull my hand away. I smiled, giving him a brief, weary nod, allowing him to firmly believe his manipulative domestic theater was actually working. I let him feel safe, knowing that the man sitting across from me was nothing more than a ghost I was preparing to exorcise. On Thursday afternoon, Adrian made her final, arrogant move. Her legal counsel transmitted a formal, heavily polished settlement offer directly to Lena Voss. It was a masterpiece of corporate condescension, dressed up in the polite sanitary language of a mutual parting of ways. The document proposed a generous buyout sum for my remaining equity. It was literally pennies on the dollar compared to the true valuation of my proprietary algorithms, but they framed it as a golden parachute designed to save my sanity. The stipulations were incredibly rigid. The offer required my immediate, voluntary resignation from the board of directors and mandated a draconian non-disclosure agreement. Her attached personal cover letter was the most infuriating piece of correspondence I had ever read. She utilized a sickly sweet, diplomatic tone, claiming she merely wanted to release me from the crushing executive burden so I could focus on my personal well-being. She positioned herself as the reluctant savior stepping in to ensure the company would not die under the heavy weight of my apparent burnout. Every instinct in my body screamed to reject the proposal instantly and counter with a massive lawsuit, but when I sat in Lena's office reviewing the paperwork, my attorney held up a single, manicured hand. Lena reminded me that the most effective traps require the prey to completely believe the door is still wide open. If we rejected the offer outright, they would immediately raise their shields and prepare for a brutal, protracted litigation war. We needed them in a room. We needed them relaxed, confident, and completely disarmed. I authorized Lena to send a highly strategic response. I agreed to accept the buyout and sign the transition papers, but I demanded one final, private mediation session to close the deal. I set an absolute, non-negotiable condition for my surrender. Every single major player had to be physically present at the table. I required Adrian, Nolan, their respective outside counsels, Boone Kessler acting on behalf of the Bridge Capital Group, and my own legal team. I wanted every single architect of my destruction trapped in the same room when the floor finally dropped out from beneath them. The meeting was set for Friday morning at 10 o'clock. The night before the summit, my internal team assembled the ammunition. We operated out of the secure conference room at Lena's firm, the air thick with the smell of printer toner and cold espresso. Tess Monroe meticulously organized two massive, heavy-duty forensic binders. She tabbed every single fraudulent vendor invoice, cross-referencing the stolen operational funds with the deposit dates of Coalbridge Strategic Partners. Rhea Dunn arrived an hour later, carrying a thick stack of freshly printed system access logs. She had highlighted Nolan's unauthorized, late-night administrative server breaches in bright, unforgiving yellow ink. While they organized the digital slaughter, I stood by the window overlooking the city, holding a single, physical photograph I had pulled from my home office before leaving. It was a candid picture taken at a dinner party at our house exactly 6 months ago. In the photograph, Nolan was raising a glass of wine, smiling warmly at the camera, his arm draped casually around my waist. Adrian was sitting across the table, laughing at something he had just said. It was the exact same night Nolan had digitally authorized the very first fraudulent payment that began the systematic bleeding of my company. I slipped the photograph carefully into the inner pocket of my leather briefcase, right next to the forensic binders. I stared out at the streetlights, feeling a profound, chilling sense of peace settle over my shoulders. For weeks, I had fantasized about how I would make them pay. I had imagined screaming matches in the hallway, dramatic public exposures, and the visceral satisfaction of causing them emotional agony. But standing in the quiet conference room, surrounded by the irrefutable evidence of my own survival, I finally understood the true nature of power. Real revenge is not about making your enemies hurt the way they hurt you. Emotional pain is subjective, messy, and ultimately fleeting. True, absolute revenge is about cold, undeniable geometry. It is the act of forcing the people who betrayed you to sit up straight under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of a corporate boardroom. It is the act of pushing a stack of paper across a polished mahogany table and forcing them to look directly at the precise timestamps, the forged signatures, and the exact, quantified measurements of their own blinding greed. I snapped my briefcase shut. I was no longer the exhausted wife. I was no longer the overwhelmed founder. I was the architect of their ruin, and I was entirely ready for the morning. The night before the final mediation, the atmosphere in the house was as brittle as dry ice. I was sitting on the edge of the bed in the guest room, where I had been sleeping for the past few weeks, staring blankly at the wall. The digital clock on the nightstand read 11 o'clock. The house was supposed to be completely quiet, but then came a soft, hesitant knock on the heavy wooden door. Before I could answer, the handle turned. Nolan stood in the doorway. He looked entirely different from the confident, perfectly groomed man who had tried to feed me breakfast a few days ago. His tie was loosened, his hair was slightly disheveled, and his posture was slumped in a carefully curated display of defeat. He stepped into the dim room, closing the door softly behind him. He began to speak, his voice a low, gravelly whisper designed to project immense vulnerability. He told me that things had spiraled completely out of his control. He claimed that the external consultant had taken the restructuring initiative significantly further than he had ever originally anticipated. He looked down at his hands, playing the part of the naive, overwhelmed operational manager who had accidentally unleashed a monster. Then, he looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes and asked if there was still a chance to save us from inside the wreckage. A year ago, that specific tone would have shattered my heart. I would have rushed to comfort him. I would have believed that it was us against the world. But tonight, I felt absolutely nothing but a deep, clinical fascination. I was watching a cornered animal try to chew its way out of a trap. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or scream about the betrayal. I simply looked at him and said nothing. Silence is the most terrifying weapon you can deploy against a guilty conscience. When you refuse to fill the conversational void, a liar will inevitably panic and start throwing information into the empty space, desperately trying to construct a bridge over the quiet. I let the silence stretch for 1 full minute. I watched the muscle in his jaw twitch. I watched the fake vulnerability in his eyes curdle into genuine, nervous anxiety. just as I anticipated, he cracked. He started rambling, practically tripping over his own words to justify his actions. He confessed that after the initial draft of the stabilization package, the capital firm had started demanding a much larger slice of the pie. He admitted that the managing partner had heavily altered the legal structure behind my back to appease the financiers. He painted himself as a passive bystander, completely paralyzed by the momentum of the deal. When he finally ran out of breath, the room fell dead silent again. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, my voice incredibly soft and devoid of any sharp edges. "If you truly want me to forgive you," I whispered, holding his desperate gaze, "if you want me to believe that you are still on my side, I cannot just take your word for it anymore. I need to see the absolute latest distribution plan. I need to see exactly what they are doing to us." It was a masterclass in reverse manipulation. I framed the request not as a demand for evidence, but as a plea for marital transparency. I offered him a false lifeline, a chance to prove his loyalty by betraying his co-conspirator. Whether it was sheer stupidity, overwhelming guilt, or a desperate belief that he could still manipulate me into signing away my life the next morning. Nolan nodded. He promised he would send it to me immediately. He practically fled the guest room. 10 minutes later, my encrypted laptop chimed. The email glowed brightly on the screen. He had forwarded a highly confidential internal document directly from his private server. It was the absolute final cap table and operational hierarchy. It was the ultimate, fatal puzzle piece. I scrolled through the densely formatted pages. There it was, spelled out in stark, undeniable black and white. The new corporate structure listed my supposed savior as the absolute majority managing partner, and directly below her name, Nolan was explicitly titled as the compensated transition principal. He had not lost control of the situation. He had actively negotiated his own lucrative severance package. He had priced his departure and my destruction a very long time ago, complete with a 6-figure payout and a guaranteed consulting retainer for the next 2 years. I forwarded the document directly to my legal counsel with a single word in the subject line: "Gotcha." Barely 20 minutes after I received Nolan's email, my personal cell phone vibrated. The caller identification displayed a number I knew all too well. It was the woman who wanted my empire. I answered on the third ring, keeping my breathing slow and even. Her voice flowed through the speaker like warm, expensive silk. It was a masterpiece of fake intimacy. She bypassed any professional greetings and dove straight into a deeply patronizing monologue. She told me that she knew how incredibly difficult tomorrow was going to be. She sighed heavily, playing the role of the burdened peacemaker. Then, she actually had the breathtaking audacity to suggest that women like us needed to stick together. She warned me not to let the fragile male ego of the men in our industry ruin a perfectly practical, lucrative business solution. The hypocrisy was so profound, so utterly detached from reality, that I actually had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. She was sleeping with my husband, stealing my proprietary algorithms, and looting my corporate accounts, yet she was trying to bond with me over feminist solidarity. "I completely agree," I replied, my voice dripping with an artificial, sugary sweetness that matched her own. "We absolutely have to do what is best for the future of the firm. I will see you at the table tomorrow." I ended the call before she could utter another word. My phone immediately lit up with a message from my attorney. The confirmation was absolute. Nolan's forwarded email was the final nail in his coffin. By sending me the cap table from his own account, he had legally tethered himself directly to the malicious intent of the hostile takeover. He could no longer claim ignorance. He could no longer hide behind the defense of being a naive operations manager swept up in a consultant's aggressive strategy. We had his digital footprint stamped all over the premeditated division of my assets. His escape route was permanently incinerated. I closed my laptop and finally laid down. The air in the room felt incredibly light. The next morning, I woke up before the sun crested the horizon. I did not feel the crushing weight of a woman about to finalize her divorce or lose her company. I felt the sharp electric anticipation of a predator stepping out of the tall grass. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet and completely ignored the soft, neutral, submissive clothing I had been wearing for the past few weeks to play the part of the broken founder. Instead, I reached straight for the back of the wardrobe. I pulled out a sharp, impeccably tailored navy blue suit. It was the exact same suit I had worn 6 years ago when I successfully negotiated and closed the very first massive municipal contract that put my firm on the map. I was not dressing for a funeral. I was not putting on mourning clothes for my dead marriage. I was putting on the armor of my own undeniable competence. I applied a coat of dark red lipstick, pulled my hair back into a severe, elegant twist, and slipped my feet into a pair of black leather stilettos that sounded like gunshots against the hardwood floor. I walked downstairs. The house was entirely silent. Nolan had already left for the downtown offices, undoubtedly anxious to review his final strategy with his mistress. I walked into my home office and stood by the mahogany desk. The decoy binder was long gone, but resting perfectly parallel to the edge of the leather blotter was the heavy gold-plated fountain pen. It was the exact pen Nolan had gently placed there weeks ago, fully expecting me to use it to blindly sign away my entire life to the woman he was sleeping with. I picked the pen up. Its weight felt perfect in my hand. I slipped it carefully into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket. They were desperately waiting for my final signature this morning, and I was absolutely going to give it to them. But the ink of this story was not going to bleed onto the pages they had prepared. I turned off the office light, walked out the front door, and drove toward the city, ready to burn their perfectly constructed world straight to the ground. The glass-walled conference room at Lena Voss's law firm overlooked the bustling downtown district, serving as a pristine, sunlit arena for what was about to become a corporate execution. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing the sharp navy blue suit that had always been my armor. Lena sat directly to my right, her posture impeccably straight, her hands resting lightly on a closed black leather portfolio. Precisely at 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy wooden doors swung open. Adrienne walked in first. She carried herself with the radiant, untouchable confidence of a woman who firmly believed she was arriving merely to collect her final prize. She wore a tailored white blazer that screamed victory, and her smile was a masterclass in polite condescension. Nolan trailed just half a step behind her, projecting the somber, supportive demeanor of a husband guiding his frail wife through a difficult transition. Boone Kessler and his 2 aggressive corporate attorneys filed in last, looking completely relaxed, carrying the unmistakable aura of men who had come to quickly finalize a highly profitable acquisition. They took their seats across from us. There was no casual small talk. Boone's lead attorney immediately slid a thick, freshly bound settlement portfolio across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of me. "We want to make this as painless as possible," the opposing attorney began, his voice dripping with practiced, synthetic empathy. "The terms are exactly what we outlined yesterday. You officially relinquish your voting rights and executive authority. In exchange, the Bridge Capital firm immediately activates the stabilization funds. You receive your generous severance buyout. You sign the standard non-disclosure agreement, and you walk away completely free from the crushing operational burden. No messy public litigation. Just a clean, quiet exit so you can finally get some rest." It was the exact same manipulative tactic they had utilized from the very beginning. They were still desperately trying to use my supposed exhaustion as their primary leverage. I looked down at the thick stack of papers. Then, I looked across the table at Nolan. He offered me a slow, encouraging nod, silently urging me to surrender my life's work to the woman sitting next to him. I did not reach for the portfolio. I did not touch a pen. I simply leaned back in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and turned my head to look at Lena. In that single, silent gesture, the entire power dynamic of the room permanently shifted. The atmosphere instantly grew heavy, the air suddenly thick and difficult to breathe. Lena did not offer a polite smile. She snapped her black leather portfolio open. The sound was as sharp as a cracking whip. My client will not be signing your settlement offer today, Lena stated, her voice echoing off the glass walls with absolute, freezing authority. In fact, my client will not be stepping down, relinquishing her equity, or accepting your severance package. Instead, we are here to formally inform you of the severe civil and criminal liabilities you have incurred over the last 8 months. Adrienne let out a short, dismissive laugh, clearly thinking this was a desperate, last-minute negotiation tactic to drive up my buyout price. Let us not make this ugly, Lena. The company is out of money. You have no leverage. We have the network access logs, Lena countered instantly, sliding the first piece of paper across the table. Printed here is the exact minute Nolan Wren utilized stolen executive credentials to bypass the internal security firewall at 2:13 in the morning. We have the automated email forwarding rules he secretly embedded in the administrative server to monitor confidential board communications. Nolan's reassuring mask instantly dissolved. His face turned a sickly shade of pale gray, and he physically recoiled from the table as if the paper was actively on fire. Furthermore, Lena continued, her pace relentless, we have the complete forensic accounting matrix of the $63,400 that was systematically siphoned out of the corporate operating reserves through fabricated vendor invoices. Every single dollar has been perfectly traced directly into the holding accounts of Colbridge Strategic Partners. The smug, confident smile on Adrienne's face completely vanished, dying right in the middle of a half-formed word. She suddenly looked like a passenger who had just realized her parachute was a backpack full of rocks. But Lena was only warming up. She pulled out the copy of the preliminary control framework that Adrienne's legal team had submitted to the bridge financiers just 24 hours prior. She placed it squarely in the center of the table. Your entire acquisition strategy was built on stolen data, Lena declared, her eyes locking onto Boone Kessler's lead attorney. However, the financial summary you stole from my client's home was a fabricated decoy. You proudly submitted a transition portfolio to your financial backers, claiming a $640,000 cash asset sitting in the Hollow Lantern escrow. That account does not exist. It is a ghost. You also submitted legal transition documents containing a highly specific spelling error regarding fiduciary duties, alongside an inverted internal accounting symbol on page 47. Those identical errors were deliberately planted in the bait document. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Boone's lead attorney, a man who charged $2,000 an hour to protect his clients from risk, stopped breathing. He stared at the printed errors, his legal mind rapidly calculating the apocalyptic magnitude of the disaster. He instantly realized that the entire client structure his firm was relying upon had been fundamentally polluted by stolen, doctored documents, hidden financial interests, and systemic, undeniable corporate fraud. He pushed his chair back from the table, physically distancing himself from Adrienne and Nolan as though they were highly contagious. Nolan panicked, the polished, charismatic operator completely shattered. He leaned forward, his hands trembling against the mahogany wood. "Everly, please, listen to me," he stammered, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is a massive misunderstanding. The pressure was enormous. Things just started moving way too fast. We were just trying to save the company. I swear to you." I did not raise my voice. I reached into the folder sitting in front of Lena and pulled out the single sheet of paper containing the email he had forwarded to me the night before. I slid it smoothly across the polished wood until it stopped right under his nose. "Would you like to read the third paragraph out loud for the room, Nolan?" I asked, my tone as cold and sharp as a surgeon's blade. "Or should I? I believe it is the section where you explicitly accept the title of compensated transition principal and officially price your departure from our marriage at a premium." Nolan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He stared at the email, completely paralyzed by the irrefutable, digital proof of his own premeditated treason. He was entirely silenced. Adrienne, however, possessed the frantic, dangerous energy of a cornered predator. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, refusing to accept the reality of her defeat. The temporary proxy is still a legally binding instrument, she snapped, glaring at Lena. She gave me 90 days of operational control. You cannot simply void a signed contract because you are angry about an accounting discrepancy. Lena smiled. It was the terrifying, victorious smile of a predator watching the trap completely snap shut. We are not voiding the proxy over an accounting discrepancy, Lena clarified, pulling out the oldest, most yellowed document from the archive. We are voiding it based on the Founder Continuity Addendum, a clause you failed to remove from the actual corporate registry because you only scrubbed it from the fake document you stole. That addendum explicitly states that any transfer of executive power is immediately rendered null and void if an undisclosed personal or financial relationship exists between the beneficiary and any acting corporate officer. Lena leaned forward, her voice dropping into a deadly whisper. We have the hotel receipts, Adrienne. We have the text messages. We know exactly what you and Nolan were doing while you were supposedly rescuing this firm. Your hidden, illicit affair is the precise legal mechanism that destroys your entire claim to power. And by attempting to use a stolen, booby-trap dossier to forcibly activate that voided proxy, you just escalated your liability from a simple governance dispute into federal corporate espionage. The room plunged into an absolutely deafening silence. There were no more arguments. There were no more lies to spin. The architecture of their betrayal had been systematically dismantled, piece by piece, until absolutely nothing remained but the ugly, naked truth of their blinding greed. I finally reached into the inner pocket of my tailored navy jacket. I pulled out the heavy gold-plated fountain pen that Nolan had left on my desk weeks ago. I uncapped it with a soft, deliberate click. I did not sign the settlement portfolio they had prepared. I pushed it aside, letting it slide off the edge of the table and spill onto the floor. Instead, Lena placed 3 separate documents in front of me. I signed the formal civil litigation filing, demanding the immediate recovery of the diverted funds with heavy punitive damages. I signed the official intellectual property injunction, permanently barring Coalbridge Strategic Partners from utilizing any of our proprietary algorithms. Finally, with a steady, unyielding hand, I signed the executive board resolution terminating Nolan Wren from all operational and administrative roles at North Key Recovery Group. Effective immediately, the meeting was over. Boone Kessler stood up without saying a single word, shooting a look of pure venom at Adrienne before marching out of the room to frantically begin saving his own firm from the fallout. Adrienne sat frozen in her chair, staring at the polished wood, suddenly facing the very real prospect of total professional and financial ruin. Nolan looked at me with hollow, devastated eyes, finally realizing he had just completely incinerated his marriage, his lucrative career, and his entire future for a woman who could not even save herself. I capped the gold pen and stood up, buttoning my jacket. I did not look back at them as I walked out of the conference room. I had kept my company. I had protected my pristine reputation. I had secured my cash flow. But most importantly, as I stepped into the bright sunlight of the city street, I knew I had reclaimed the ultimate power, the absolute, unwavering right to never, ever make a traitor feel comfortable in my presence again. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. And I invite you to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.